Hi, my name is Joel Tax. I'm with Reserve Data Analysis, and this presentation is just for the typical condominium association. We're going to go over some basics here on the reserve studies and answer some questions at the end. I have some submissions here through our website, and I've made some slides which hopefully make it a little bit easier to understand some of the basic concepts. So let's get started. First, what we are going to cover today, why it's important to budget for reserves, what is a reserve study, how a reserve study helps in the budgeting process, and what's included in a reserve study. Again, like I said, I'm also going to be answering some questions here at the end. So the biggest question, why even bother budgeting for reserves? What's the point? In our opinion, the most important factor is fairness to the community membership. We want to make sure that everybody is paying their fair share into the reserve account over the life expectancy of the building. So people in year one are paying 1/20th of, say, a roofing cost. If the roof costs or lasts 20 years, we want to make sure that the people living in the community in year one pay for 1/20th of the roof. Now we have to take other things into consideration like inflation, so future dollars are worth less than current dollars, so the actual monetary amount will be different. We'll kind of touch bases on that in a minute. Second of all, lower stress level for both community members and boards. If you have a budget in place, people have expectations of what projects are coming due when, and people know how much things are going to cost, and you're able to get bids ahead of time and all that good stuff. Much less stress than having to scramble for money essentially constantly every year. It's a very stressful situation that we see many boards and communities going through. Also, property values and the marketability of their properties. Say you're in a community that hasn't budgeted for reserves and you're having to defer projects and either get money through a loan or special assessments that may need to be passed in a year, the following year, or having to raise dues that next year. Oftentimes you have to push out projects like paint projects when buildings will have flaking and peeling paint, fences are falling down, there's cracks in concrete which are safety hazards, things like that. When buyers come into a property and they see paint peeling off a building, that gives them a very bad kind of a curb appeal projection of that project. Why would they buy a unit in your project if the project across the street is taking care of everything and everything looks nice, as opposed to yours which has peeling paint and whatnot? Well, the marketability of those two projects are quite different. A buyer would typically go with the project that is taking care of the components. Now, if a community has deferred maintenance issues, oftentimes the price will also be less. So in one way or another, the homeowners in the project that have deferred maintenance are paying for it. They're paying it for with lower property values essentially. And it's actually the most costly way to pay for these projects, and we'll get into that in a little bit later. And planning ahead, it's much cheaper to plan ahead and budget for these expected projects, say to the roof, to the siding, to the paint, to the windows. All these items, it's much cheaper to plan for and budget for it years and years in advance. If you're having to do it last minute, you're either going to have to raise funds last minute via special assessment or a loan. Loans are extremely costly. You may pay 1.5 times what the actual cost is after you pay all the interest and whatnot on the loan. So extremely costly and extremely difficult for a community to pay for a loan, as well as try to get on a sound financial footing. Very difficult in that scenario. Okay, so what is a reserve study? As you'll see in this building here, we have many components here. We have a roof. We have several different roofing types. We have mechanical equipment on top of the roof. We have several different siding types. We have brick, what appears to be wood here, or could be fiber cement. We have asphalt, asphalt overlay, asphalt seal coat. We have fencing, we have lighting, we have lots of landscaping. It's hard to see in this picture over here. They also had a retention pond that they were required to maintain. So all these components for the building and the site, and many, many more that I didn't mention, they're all going to fail at some point in time. The useful life of all these components will reach a point when it's no longer serving its purpose. The roof may be leaking, the paint may be peeling, the retention pond may need to be cleaned out and inspected and whatnot. So all these things have very, very large expenses over time, but they may be very infrequent. So a roof, maybe you only need to replace every 20 years. Perhaps the retention pond you can get away with a few years without doing anything with it before it, the vegetation grows and whatnot. Asphalt overlay, 25 years or so. So these expenses, they're not every day, and this is often the reason why people don't put it on their radar. They think, oh, it'll get done at some other point. We'll let somebody else worry about it. But the problem is, as each board does that year in and year out, all of a sudden you're 15 years in to a new building, roof needs to be replaced in, say, 5 years, and there's no money in the reserve account. At that point in time, it's a mad scramble for most communities to try to get the money into a reserve account via several factors, special assessments, raising the dues significantly, and loans. But again, this is an unfair scenario because it should have been spread out amongst all the community members over time, not just those community members that happen to be in the community when the useful life of that particular component fails. So what we're trying to do here in a reserve study, we're trying to take seemingly random expenses to roofs and siding and paint and asphalt and pools and mechanical equipment and whatnot, and we're trying to create an orderly budget, and that's something we can actually do because we have very good data for the useful life of components, and we have very good data for the cost of components. So because of that, budgeting is possible. We can create a very useful budget that's going to help the community get over these hurdles without having to rely on loans or special assessments or deferred maintenance. So the main problem is, how do we budget for infrequent but costly projects? As a reserve state professional, we need to take into account fairness to the community members. We need to take into account cost efficiencies, timing of the projects, and statutory requirements. A solution that a reserve state professional is going to do is they're going to provide funding models that follow a fair, predictable, and manageable manner. So the community members are going to be paying their fair share over time, and the dues that are required in the recommended funding models are typically not outrageous. They're usually right in line with what they should be. Now, some communities will be to a point where there's just not possible to raise the dues to a level that covers those expenses, and that's when a special assessment, unfortunately, would be required. Loans are extremely difficult to secure, especially for a community that's already in a bad financial situation. So we really don't like to rely on those at all, or even consider those in a recommended funding model. And as I mentioned earlier, we want to make sure that there's fairness to the community membership over time. So as all these components deteriorate, in this particular building, we have decks and railings, fencing, we have mechanical equipment, elevators, paint, roofing. All these things are going to deteriorate over time. We want to make sure everybody's paying their fair share into that reserve account to pay for these items over time. Poor planning leads to reliance on, number one, special assessments. It's unfair to the membership. They're very difficult to pass, and the membership has to scramble for money in their own personal lives. So if they didn't have $5,000 or $10,000 to fork over to an HOA, it can be a very difficult position. It's oftentimes when you see people having to sell their condominium units to just get out of it because say they don't have enough equity in it to get a loan. They have to sell it in order to pay for that, and then unfortunately they're now having to find a new place of residence. Another issue is deferred maintenance. This lowers the marketability and the values of the units. And membership is definitely unhappy about it. Nobody likes to come home and see deferred maintenance issues, especially when you're paying dues every month and you wonder where that money is going. So we want to make sure that you stay on top of it, and it retains the marketability and hopefully improves the marketability over time, and people are much happier about it. Increased liability and stress on boards. Again, if you're making financial decisions for a community, you have to remember that these are the money in the reserve account and the operating account is the community's money. It's not any individual's money. It's a community as a whole, to make sure you're making sound financial decisions for that community. That's why you've been elected to the board. And lastly, loans. Like I said, they're very difficult to secure, and we never suggest communities relying on that for future budgeting, because they're very difficult. A community that is already in a bad financial position has an extremely difficult time getting a loan, just as a person would try to go into a bank that has no job. It's going to be very difficult for that person to get a loan. If a person with a good job and a good savings goes into a bank and asks for a loan, much easier. But again, an HOA, a condominium, which has a lot of money in the bank, is probably not going into the bank to get a loan because it's extremely costly. And lastly, it also lowers the market appeal. So when a buyer comes in and they see that there's a loan outstanding, or there's a loan about to be implemented or passed or secured that they're going to have to pay off, they're going to directly take that into consideration before they buy that unit. They want to make sure they understand how much they're going to be paying every month, and including any type of a loan that needs to be repaid over time. Budgeting is much cheaper. So if you budget accurately, you can have a healthy reserve account balance, and you can gain interest on that reserve account balance. Right now, interest rates are extremely low, historically low, so there's not a whole lot of money to be made there, and it has a very minimal impact. Over time, though, these interest rates will go back up at some point in time, and reserve accounts will again start to gain interest on that money. Some communities also invest their reserve accounts into very secure and safe investments, things like CDs, bank CDs. Also, when you budget, you understand what projects are going to be coming up in the future. You're able to get more bids, and you're able to kind of pick who you're going to work with in the future, as opposed to last minute not having an idea of when projects are going to be coming up. You may have only time to grab one bid, or maybe even only one vendor calls you back if you need, say, a roof replaced in the next month, and everybody's very busy. Maybe you get one big bid back, and they know that you're desperate and they're going to give you a high bid, so you end up paying much more. Also, when you do budgeting, you take advantage of cost efficiencies. You can do projects at a similar time, so that hopefully the costs are minimized. You can do, say, a roof replacement at the same time you do the gutters. You can do decks refurbishment at the same time you do a paint project. Things like that, so that you're not having to both shut down areas of the community to do these projects. At different times. You can just do them all at once. Say one summer you go through and do all the painting of the building, as well as railings and the decks. Maybe those need to be replaced, instead of having to do it over 2 years or phased. If you can do them all at the same time, it's much cheaper. You can only, maybe they just put up the scaffolding once, as opposed to having to come back out and do it several times. They're going to charge you more for that. And a reserve study is an excellent tool to utilize for budgeting. Within the reserve study is the component list. So during the site inspection, a reserve analyst goes out to the site and does a full inventory of all the building and site components. These are going to be anything from asphalt to the square footage of the siding, square footage of the roof, the number of lights in the on site in the landscaped areas, resurfacing the pool. All these things need to be accounted for. And first and foremost, what we need to do is take an inventory. So we go out and we spend a day taking measurements and pictures and notes and all that good stuff to make sure that we do have a comprehensive component list. Second of all, in the reserve study is a replacement schedule. So we have a component list that we then assign useful life and remaining useful life to components. And so now we have a replacement schedule over time where we can see when projects are projected to come due. And this is when we can take advantage of, say, cost efficiencies, when we can project to do projects at the same time or in a similar year where they can be done efficiently, and as opposed to have vendors coming out over and over and over to do different aspects of the building. So projects, say the painting, you want to do it all at one time. You don't want to have a painter come out several times to one building or two buildings. They're just going to charge you more for it. They want to come out, they want to get it all done, and they want to leave. If you phase a paint project, something like that, it's just going to cost more in the long run. And that's what we're trying to prevent. We're trying to minimize the cost, especially in the reserve state. We're trying to show what's the most efficient way to do these items and the most efficient cost-wise. Also in the reserve study, we're going to have recommendations and the current adequacy of the reserve account. So recommendations, we want to make sure we get over these years when there's going to be large expenses for projects that come due, and we want to make sure that the community and association is adequately prepared for those financially and is able to get over those years without having to rely on loans, special assessments, and deferred maintenance. Also in the reserve study is a calculation we call percent funded. This is essentially the adequacy of the reserve account. So how much is in the reserve account versus how much ideally would be in the reserve account at a specific point in time. And we give that for a current percent funded, and we do projections for percent funded into the future based on the different funding models. So we have a recommended funding model, we have, say, a baseline funding model, we have another funding model, just the current funding model, what's the current rate, that the association is budgeting for, and are they projected to, say, run into a deficit where they're going to run out of money, where the percent funded drops to zero. So we want to make sure that a community understands where they're at and how adequate their reserve account is at this point in time when we do the reserve study. So within the reserve study, we have a comprehensive component list. Again, if you'll see here, you'll see the component list here, descriptions. Also, it's going to have a date and service for these different components, the next replacement year, useful life of that, remaining useful life. We can make adjustments to the components. So say an asphalt road is deteriorating faster than what is typical. Maybe it was installed inadequately. Maybe there's a high water table there, or drainage issues. Whatever the case is, it's not uncommon for a component to deteriorate faster than what would be typical. In that case, we can make adjustments to that in the reserve study to budget for the, say, an asphalt road, which usually lasts 25 years, and it appears it's only going to last 20 years. We can make an adjustment to that in the reserve study so we can project out the expenses at 20 years instead of 25. Also, we're going to, in this component list, we're going to show the inventory taken during the site inspection, unit cost, and current cost. So that's the total cost for that component. Unit cost multiplied by the units, number of units. In a reserve study, you'll also see charts and graphs. In this case, we have year-end balances, in the light blue, in the dark red, disbursements. So that's the expected expenditures for this particular community. And we have the different funding models there. We have recommended, current, a baseline. Components not listed there on this particular one. But as you'll see, there's many graphs and charts in our reserve studies which will show visually where a community is going to be and the different funding models as they compare to one another. You're also going to have an annual replacement schedule. So this is just each year and the projected expenses and projects are going to become due in each given year, as well as totals. So in this case, we have an example here, replacement year 2017. We have all the components that are projected to come due in that year, and the total, the cost expected in that particular year. Now these are projections, so the first 5 years in the reserve study projections, those are very, very likely to come due very, very soon. Now the further out we go, the less accurate projections are going to be. So a roof that typically lasts 25 years may in reality only last 23 years, or it may last 27 years. But you know, as long as it was installed correctly, we have very, very good averages that are very, very accurate. And this is just after looking at thousands and thousands of buildings. You come to conclusions and you have data to back it up. So in a reserve study as well, you're going to have a summary page similar to this one. We're going to have a percent funded calculation here, 14% in this scenario. We have a recommended funding model, a baseline. Baseline just is a funding model that keeps the reserve count above 0 for the 30 years covered in the reserve study. And we have a current funding model. So this is how much the association is currently funding. In this case, you can see it's much, much lower than either the baseline, which just keeps the count at 0 or above for the 30 years, as well as it's very much, much lower than the recommended. So at some point in time, this community, relatively shortly, probably, by the looks of it here, is going to run out of money. They're going to be in a deficit, which they're going to have to rely on special assessments, loans, or deferred maintenance. Now, unfortunately, this is a very common scenario, and this is one of the reasons why we're in this business. We want to try to get the word out there and try to help communities get to a position where they are financially sound and they don't have to rely on special assessments and loans and deferred maintenance. Some common expenses for condominiums. Some of these are not not evident to people that live in the community or board members that may not be familiar with building systems, as well as components that are not visible. Systems in a condominium building, electrical, plumbing, and fire systems. These may only need to be updated every 30 to 40 or even 50 years, but when they do, they're extremely costly. Want to make sure, especially on a building past, say, 20 years, that these items are taken into account, because those costs are going to be very, very high. And if, like most communities, if they're not on their radar, they're going to get hit with extremely high expenses. Elevators, another large expense that come due maybe only every 30 years or so to modernize an elevator. Mechanical equipment, HVAC equipment, boilers, these are extremely costly. They could be on the roof and require cranes. If the building's high enough, sometimes they require a helicopter. Extremely expensive to replace these mechanical equipment pieces. Exterior of the buildings, including paint and repairs to the siding. This could be wood, stucco, fiber cement, could be concrete, could be brick, all types of different siding. There's the roofing system, which is, we have roofing material, whether it's composition shingle or some type of membrane or torch down, whatever the case is, as well as flashing and gutters and downspouts. We have decks, waterproofing and refurbishments of the decks. Deck waterproofing, extremely important. If you don't do that on a regular basis, typically we suggest every 5 years to top coat a deck to make sure it is waterproofed. And this is a particular type of deck. Some other types of deck do not require it, but most decks for condos do. If you don't waterproof a deck that should last 25 to 30 years may last 15 years, and it may need to be completely replaced as opposed to just refurbished or repaired. And the cost can be double or triple if just by not waterproofing the deck, which essentially is just putting a top coat of elastomeric coating. It's like a very thick paint and that's rubberized and it waterproofs. So just by not doing that, you can have extremely high costs related to deck replacement or refurbishments that should never have taken place. Other items like windows and doors, very infrequent. It may be only 40 to 50 years that you have to replace those items, but when they come due, they're extremely costly. Recreation for a condominium, we have pools, sports courts, playground equipment, all that definitely has costs related to it, and again may not be that frequent, but when they come due they can be extremely costly. There's also safety hazard related to some of these items. So you have to have, say, a fence around a pool, or you have to have a playground equipment. It has to have adequate chips or something else to soften the landing for kids. If you don't have these items, or you defer the maintenance on it or whatnot, then it's a huge safety issue, and liability increases significantly in those communities if somebody were to get hurt or to drown or whatever the case is. Sites on a community, site components could include concrete surface repairs. So when cracks form from, say, tree roots, you want to make sure those are ground down, or the asphalts, or excuse me, the concrete is re-poured. If somebody's walking by and trips on that and breaks their arm, that's a lawsuit just waiting. Asphalt, seal coats, and overlays. Maybe that's only every 25 years for an overlay. Seal coats, you should be doing every 5 years or so. A community that decides they don't want to do seal coats for that say, a parking lot, maybe the overlay will only last 15 to 20 years instead of 25 to 30 years. So there's a negative impact for those components when you don't adequately maintain them. Things like asphalt and paint. If you don't do that on a regular basis, it's going to cause more damage, and it's going to be worse off for the community financially and budgeting wise. Other items that are not apparent oftentimes is landscaping, underground sprinklers, and drainage issues. This comes up quite often where we see root issues and whatnot totally destroying an underground sprinkler system, and they have to go in and totally dig it all up, tear up all the landscaping, redo the underground sprinkler piping, and then having to redo all the landscaping. Extremely expensive, but it does happen over time, and again, it may only be every 25, 30 years, but when the system goes down and you have to replace it, that cost is significant. So a reserve analyst, when we go out to do a reserve study and we compile it and put it all together, our main goal is to find the right fit for that community. So the objective is to create a funding model that the community can follow, which is fair and realistic, and it works off their current financial position and gets them into a better position over time. Now, it may take a number of years, and there may be a number of years where we have to make very difficult decisions and have to raise dues and or even implement a special assessment. But at some point, a community needs to get, in our opinion, onto a sound financial path if over time the goal is to have a reserve account that's adequately funded and whatnot. So here at Reserve Data Analysis, I just like to throw this in. Some of the items that I like to point out that we do, we include multiple funding models. We have a video summary of the report. So anybody can go in and review and watch the video overview of what's going on with that particular community and what our recommendations are. We have online documents stored so anybody can access, anybody with the link that we provide to the board can access the reserve study as well as the documents like plans and specs, the governing documents. Our studies include assessment and disclosure forms that comply with statutory requirements. Washington State, these are very difficult and they're due annually. So if you don't have a reserve study, it'd be extremely difficult for somebody on the board to create a disclosure document to the community without having a reserve study. They would have to be very familiar with the whole process and all the calculations involved. It would be very difficult for somebody that has never done a reserve study before. We have experienced and designated professionals. We don't rely on trainees. Everybody here has many, many years of experience for different types of properties and communities and whatnot for reserve studies. And most of all, we have what we feel is a very, very high level of customer service, and we're available to everybody when you need us. So, like I said earlier, I'm just going to do some. I'm going to answer some questions here that were submitted via our website, and I've made some slides to hopefully help make this go a little bit smoother, and there's a better understanding of exactly what we're talking about when we're trying to answer these questions. So the first question I have here is how is percent funded calculated? And let me just go to that slide real quick, and we're just going to do a quick review. So what is percent funded? Well, it's the amount that's in the reserve account at the bank versus how much would ideally be in the account at a particular point in time. So we have, and that formula is simple. It's the reserve account balance divided by the fully funded balance, and that's going to give you a percentage figure. And let's go into how that is calculated. Okay, so the best way to answer this question is to give a sample here. And in this scenario, we're going to ignore inflation and interest just for simplicity's sake in the math. They change the math slightly, well, significantly over a period of time, but we're going to just keep it very simple here on the math. So say we have a building here that needs to be painted at the end of 10 years with an expected cost of $100,000. So in this particular community, we have, again, this graph here. We have 10 years. This is the time period we need to save this $100,000. And we have the amount on the left side here from 10,000 up to 100,000. So in year one, and this would be an ideal community, this is how much they should be setting aside each year. Year one, they're going to want to set aside $10,000 because they've utilized 1/10 of the paint of that building. And since we know we have a projection of $100,000 at the end of 10 years, that first year is going to be $10,000. Now, year two, they're going to be adding another $10,000, again, because they're utilizing 1/10 of the paint of that building. Year three, another 10, and as you can see, each time they add 10,000, the total balance is increased by $10,000. Year one, it's 10,000. The total reserve account balance at the end of year two is 20,000. At the end of year three is 30,000, and so on and so forth. We go all the way up here till we get to $100,000, and there's enough in the reserve account to pay off the vendor to paint the building. Again, the costs are split equally amongst all of the community members, because the people in year one, the community members living there in year one, paid $10,000, 1/10 of the cost, and they continued to do so each and every year until they got up to this $100,000 mark. It's good to note here that the fully funded balance just means that the community is on track to pay for these expenses. So in this sample, this community is 100% funded each and every one of those 10 years. because they are on track the entire time. They're getting up to $100,000. And because they are on track, they have an ideal amount in the reserve account. They are 100% funded. Now, it's very important to note, in year one, when they're 100% funded, they do not have enough money to pay for the $100,000 project. They only have $10,000 in their reserve account. But we consider it 100% funded because they have deposited their fair share into the reserve account. So 1/10 the cost of that paint. As we go to the next graph here, this just reiterates they're 100% funded the entire 10-year period. Each and every year they would be considered 100% funded. And lo and behold, at the end of 10 years, they have $100,000 in their reserve account. Now, let's look at another community that decides that they do not want to set aside $10,000 in their reserve account. In this case, this community, and again, we're ignoring inflation and interest here, this community only deposits $5,000 into the reserve account each year, instead of the $10,000 each year that the prior example indicated. So in this case, they have $5,000 the first year. This is the reserve account total balance. Then year two, at the end of year two, they have $10,000, again, because they only added $5,000 more to the reserve account. Year three, $15,000. Year four, $20,000, so on and so forth. So at the end of year 10, they're 50% funded. They have a shortfall here. And the issue is that at the end of 10 years, the paint still needs to get done. The project has to get done. They say that if there's peeling paint and whatnot, there's no choice but to paint the building. So in this scenario, in year 10, it's those community members which are paying all of this this amount, about $55,000, as opposed to where they should have only been paying $10,000 if they were budgeting adequately the prior 9 years. So they're having to make up for the prior 9 years lack of budgeting, because these folks in the community, or these board members, decided they wanted, usually the scenarios, they want to keep the HOA dues as low as possible. The ending scenario was that these community members had to make up for it. Again, I always like to remind communities that the costs are actually going to happen. These aren't projections that they may or may not happen. They always happen. And whether they actually happen on year 9 or year 11, that's, perhaps you could argue with that a little bit. But overall, it's going to happen within a very short time period of when they're projected. And that's not taking into consideration other items, like if something was not installed correctly. And those items may have significantly reduced useful lives, and the expenses may be much higher, much sooner than expected. So in this case, we're just working with one component. Just for simplicity's sake, we're ignoring interest, inflation. But you can see how the prior 9 years membership lack of budgeting directly had an impact on the membership in year 10. They're having to make up the difference to pay for that paint project. Now, how are they going to make up this difference? That is a very, very tough scenario. That's a lot of money they're going to have to come up with. So oftentimes this is when a special assessment is implemented or a loan is secured. Whatever the case is, it's community members in year 10 that are paying for it. Community members in year 1 oftentimes are not even in the community anymore. So they've made these decisions back then that they're not impacted by whatsoever at future, 10, 20 years down the road. And that is exactly what we're trying to prevent in a reserve study. We want to make sure everybody's paying their fair share. Again, as we go back to the prior community, which is 100% funded the entire time, everybody pays their fair share. As you can see with the different colors for the allocation of the reserve account, everybody is paying $10,000 in each particular year. All right, next question. So, well, the question was, how is it calculated? So we're just taking the actual amount in the reserve account and dividing it by the fully funded balance. And as you can see in this community, which is 50% funded, they're contributing half of what they should. So in year one, when they should have been contributing 10,000, they only contributed 5,000. In year two, when they should have been contributing an additional 10,000, they only contributed an additional 5,000. So they have half the amount in the reserve account that they should. Next question, what is the fully funded balance? Okay, so we kind of touched base on that just a minute ago. The fully funded balance is just an ideal amount in the reserve account at a particular point in time. So the fully funded balance changes every year. Depending, in this scenario, we just have one component. In a real life scenario, we have many, many components, sometimes hundreds of components, all with different useful lives and remaining useful lives. And it's a very much a moving target, which goes up and down depending on what projects are due and what have been completed. In this scenario, this very, very simple example, the fully funded balance in year one is 10,000. In year two, it's 20,000. In year three, it's 30,000, and so forth. It's good to note here that this fully funded balance after year 10 is, again, it's going to drop down to $10,000 again. Again, we're completely ignoring interest and inflation. So we're going to pretend like between year 11 and 20, the paint project is again projected to be $100,000. In reality, it's going to be much higher than that. It's probably going to be double that. But for this, mathematically, for this example, we're just going to pretend like in year 11, when we're starting this whole cycle over again, and they're going to have to start projecting their budget for the next 10 years, we want to make sure that they're adequately prepared for that. So that fully funded balance and in year 11 is going to go back down to $10,000 because now they're trying to budget every year to get on track to save another $100,000 by year 20. Okay. Next question, shouldn't interest offset inflation? So this is an extremely common question we get, and there's a big misunderstanding with boards about why interest does not offset inflation. So interest is a positive, has a positive impact on the overall budgeting for a community. Right now it's very, very low, typically under 1%, unless you perhaps are in a CD or something like that, an investment, and perhaps you might be getting 1% right now. Hopefully over time this goes back up and there's a little bit more of an impact. But the reason the interest has such a minimal impact compared to inflation is that interest is only earned on your actual reserve account balance. So only the amount, if you have $100,000 in the reserve account and you earn 1% interest, that's $1,000 you will earn in 1 year. As opposed to the impact inflation, inflation impacts the cost of all the components over time in the building. So say you have a building with an estimated liabilities of $1 million for common area components over a 30-year period. So the impact of the inflation for that $1 million, and this would be a current cost of $1 million, is going to be much higher. Say a typical 3% inflation. So inflation on $1 million is $30,000. So in just 1 year, the impact of interest on a $100,000 reserve account is only $1,000, as opposed to a 3% inflationary impact on the cost of the components is $30,000 in this example. So it's a very, very small impact. And typically the building costs are much, much greater than the reserve account. A reserve account does not need to be the total cost of all the components over time. Again, what we're trying to do is we're not trying to under budget and we're not trying to over budget. So we're trying to make sure that everybody's paying their fair share. They're not paying too little or too much in each and every particular year. Good things to note here, inflation at 3% to a cost, say a roof, that's going to last 20 to 25 years at 3% compound inflation. That price doubles every 23.5 years. And that's it's important to note that oftentimes people will give me an invoice of the prior roof replacement, and they're wondering why our costs are so much higher in the reserve study. Well, it's because of compound inflation, and it's has a very, very big impact, especially on these components. Most of these large expense components, which may only come up 20 to 30 years, they will absolutely double or more in price over that period of time, and that's directly attributed to 3% compounding inflation. Okay, so hopefully that's a good understanding. It's just inflation impacts the cost of all the components as opposed to interest, which impacts only your actual reserve account balance. So next question, is percent funded realistic? Can a community be low percent funded even if it has completed most of its large expense projects? Absolutely. So let's go back to this other chart. Okay, so in this prior example, we had a $100,000 paint project every 10 years, ignoring inflation and interest and whatnot. So say this is their only component. They have reached a, one way or another, they have paid the paint project $100,000, and they're going to restart that next year, that 11th year. So absolutely, they can be 0% funded if they don't allocate any money to their reserve account, or they can be 100% funded again. So that 11th year, when to be on track again, they're going to need to put another $10,000 into the reserve account. They're going to be 100% funded if they do that. So is it realistic? Yes. So people often get this they have a misunderstanding of how it's what numbers we're utilizing to reflect this percent funded figure. So we're not looking at past projects, we're looking at future projects. So this is budgeting for the future. This is what a percent funded calculation is. So just because you just did all these components and say you just replaced your roof and your siding and this, that, and the other, well, you still have to reserve, budget for reserves that year and the following year and the year after that and the year after that. Just because something was replaced doesn't mean it's not going to be needed to be replaced again. And in this case, with this paint project for $100,000, in the 11th year, they're going to need to put $10,000 into their reserve account to be 100% funded again. Oftentimes, unfortunately, communities will have this perception that, well, we just did all the large projects, let's cut our dues, let's reduce the dues, people are tired of paying such high HOA dues. And what happens is they go from a decent funded level to a very, very poor funded level very, very quickly. So in this scenario, let's just pretend like this community, which just replaced its roof in year 10, let's just pretend these are year 11 through year 20, and they decide to reduce their HOA dues by half. Well, they'd be 50% funded, meaning they have 50% of what they ideally would have in year 11, year 12, 13, 14, so on and so forth until year 20. And in this scenario, year 20, the community members at that point in time will have to pay for the difference. They'll have to make up for the past community members not paying their fair share. So a community can absolutely go from a high percent funded level to a low percent funded level very, very quickly by either not increasing their dues regularly, or if they slash, say, their allocation rate to their reserve account and correspondingly lower the HOA dues. So Yes, that is absolutely an issue that we see all the time when communities do large projects. They decide that, well, we want to lower our dues, and all of a sudden the community that may have been decently funded one year, within a couple years, has an extremely low funded rate, and it's just it's a misunderstanding of the math behind it, and how and why things are budgeted for. Again, we're budgeting for the future, so we're not worried about what past projects you've done. What we're worried about is the future projects that are projected to be done and how to budget for those adequately. Let's see here. Next question, how do you determine what components to include in the reserve study? Let's see here. Here we go. So the components, first of all, we utilize National Reserve Study Standards that was created by the Community Association Institute. It's a 4-part test, and essentially what it is we look at each component and we ask 4 questions. We say, is it the association's responsibility? Does the component have a limited useful life? Does it have a predictable remaining useful life? And is it above whatever minimum threshold cost the association has determined is appropriate for their community? So a threshold cost in a large community, maybe $2,500 or $5,000, and anything below that they just pay out of the operating account. They don't want to reserve for it. A very small community, perhaps it's $500. Now, Washington State, the law states that any reserve component that's over 1% of the budget must be included in the reserve study. So that's the law in Washington State. Other states have different laws. Hawaii has some very different laws, as well as California. So that's the 4-part test, and then we also take in consideration statutory requirements. And when we apply that to each component, we determine, well, is it included? Why is it included? Why not? If we exclude something or unfunded in the reserve study, we make sure we make note of it and why it's not funded for. Perhaps there's a good example is concrete retaining walls. Well, there's really as long as they were installed correctly, it's very difficult to predict their useful life. So does it have a predictable useful life? And does it have a limited remaining useful life? Very, very difficult to say for a concrete retaining wall that was installed quickly. We see them 70, 80 years old and they're still there. So something like that, oftentimes we will not fund for it. We will not recommend funding for it in the reserve study because it's very difficult to determine. And as long as it was installed correctly, oftentimes they have a useful life in excess of the building. And that's just one example. There's others, but that 4-part test we apply to each component first to determine if we're going to include it, as well as statutory requirements. Okay, next question. Why are special assessments considered bad? Our community relies on them instead of having to worry about budgeting. All right, let's see here. So special assessments. First of all, the special assessments should not be relied on, in our opinion, for any community, because the special assessment unfairly charges whoever is in that community at that particular time for the lack of budgeting for prior members. Now, nowadays people move a lot. Oftentimes you will not have people living in one community more than 4 or 5 years. And they often do have a perception in their minds that, well, I'm not going to be here in 15, 20 years. Why do I care about budgeting for the roof? Well, it's not about the future cost. It's about their current use of that roof. The community members each and every year utilize that roof over their heads. They should be paying their fair share of the total cost when it comes due. Essentially, it is paying their fair share of the deterioration of that component. And it's going to be many components. And so there's misconception of people thinking that, oh, this is only a future cost that I don't have to worry about. Well, in reality, it's a current cost because you're currently utilizing these different components in the community. So we want to make sure that we're fairly distributing that cost to all the membership. And the special assessment for projected expenses and expected expenses should not be relied on. This could be paint, roofing, windows, all these items. They're also very, very difficult to pass. You have to get oftentimes community approval, even when you only have several board members, often very, very difficult to pass. People have different opinions on how to do it. Then you have to decide how to implement it, who pays what and how much. Is it based on the square footage of the building? When somebody moved in, how long somebody's lived there. All these things come up when special assessments, when there's talk of special assessments in a community. The vast majority of the time, they should never have been relied on. We see it all the time for things like paint or roof replacement. Those are items that should have been budgeted for well in advance. Not saying that there isn't a space for special assessments. If something catastrophically fails that was not projected and is, say, very unusual, that is probably a special assessment. That happens sometimes. We've seen anything from, say, hillsides that required resloping and whatnot, or drainage issues on hillsides, things that people just didn't have projections for or an estimation on, because nobody really knew that the hillside was not adequate for that area, or was not adequately shored up, or whatever the case was. So there are reasons for special assessments, but they are very rare, and we see them all the time for very common items that they should not be utilized for. Okay, next question. Are there ways to minimize reserve allocation rates? There are. Let's see here. So to minimize the reserve contributions, first of all, when we're doing reserve study, we utilize a cash flow method. So essentially what we're doing is trying to take a 30-year period, and we're trying to take projections for all the expenses within that 30 years, and we're trying to split it up equally amongst all the homeowners over that 30 years. So the expenses are equally split. And when I say equal, I don't mean the exact same amount of money, because we also have inflation that we're talking about. So people are paying their fair share of the deterioration of the component. In year one in a community, it's going to be less than in year 20, because the dollar is worth less in year 20, and it's going to cost more to buy the same thing. So monetarily wise, people will pay different amounts, but if you look at just deterioration of the component, they're going to pay their fair share of the deterioration. So that's the first way to do it, is utilize the cash flow method. There's other methods, the straight line funding method, which is a more conservative approach, and it's more difficult to follow because you have to follow each component and set aside money for each component. It's very difficult, and it was used in the past more, and the industry found that it was very, very difficult for communities to follow that funding model, just because it requires a significant amount of time and effort to try to do that. So a cash flow method is a kind of an in-between, and it's proved to be realistic and adequate for the vast majority of communities out there. Another way to minimize reserve contributions is to put the reserve account, the reserve money into an interest-bearing account at a bank. Some communities decide they want to put in low-risk investments. There's always a risk, no matter how low risk there are. You can get higher returns, but at least an interest-bearing account. Some communities that have a large amount of money, they put it into CDs. Absolutely nothing wrong with that, and you can get a higher return. However, I do like to make a note, in around 2007, 2008, when there was a financial kind of crisis in the United States, many communities that we had worked with, they had been putting their money into what they perceived as being low risk investments, I guess by their broker or whatnot. I'm not sure who advised them on some of these issues, but they did, and they end up losing 20, 30, 40% of their reserve account in a very, very short period of time. At the same time, obviously they got scared. They sold whatever investments they typically had at that point in time, and they did not, get the return. So even though the stock market has come back now, most of those communities that we saw lose money, they did not have any type of return because they got very scared and they didn't want to lose all their reserve account balance, which at the time, kind of sky was falling type of scenario. So it is risky, and you just want to make sure that you are actually in low risk investments, not in something that's perceived as low risk or somebody telling you it's low risk. The next one down, no double dipping. We want to make sure that in your budget, we're not budgeting for the same thing in the operating account as well as the reserve account. So if you do, say you paint your hallways, say you have an on-site personnel that does the painting of the hallways, interior hallways in the community, we don't want to put that in the reserve account. We don't want to put that in the reserve study and then recommend budgeting for it because it's already being paid out of the operating account. Now, there's different scenarios. Sometimes we're told they just want to budget in the reserves just for the materials for the paint and not the labor because they're already paying somebody for the labor. So we can do that as well. We just have in the reserve study, we have material cost and we remove the labor cost. Something like that. So that's double dipping. You just want to make sure you're not paying for the same component in two different spots of the budget. You want to make sure that they are separate and only once. And then properly maintaining components. You want to make sure, a good example is asphalt roads. Want to make sure that over time you are adequately maintaining the asphalt roads with seal coats so that the much more costly overlays or replacement, depending on how bad it gets, of the asphalt is first of all extended out in time, and also the expense is minimized. Now some communities we go to, they say, well, we don't want to do seal coats, so we don't want to pay for that every 5 years. We're just going to let it ride and see what happens. And the vast majority of the time, the asphalt that should last 25 to 30 years only lasts 15 to 20 years. And on top of that, there's oftentimes significant damage. And if it's bad enough, they can't do an overlay. They have to go and rip it all up and just replace all the asphalt, as opposed to just doing an overlay, which is, again, way more costly. So they're skipping over some maintenance, essentially resulting in much higher costs when it comes time for the larger expense to replace or doing major refurbishments to the asphalt, so say via an overlay or total replacement. That's a great example. Another one would be painting of siding, wood siding. If you're not painting it regularly, water is going to get in between the siding. When they paint, they typically will seal where necessary as well. So if you're not painting regularly, the siding is going to get damaged by the water. This is most apparent with wood siding and stucco and whatnot, where in the Pacific Northwest here, we get a lot of rain and moisture gets behind there and it starts rotting out siding. And so siding that should have lasted 30, 40 plus years is only lasting 20 years and has to be replaced, or large sections that have to be replaced, which should never have happened if regular paint cycles were followed. All right, next question. What are some common mistakes you see that communities make? Okay, so number one, relying on loans or special assessments. I'm going to add that in there first. Loans are extremely costly. You have to pay back the however much you borrowed plus interest. So earlier when we had this $100,000 paint project, a community that gets a loan for $100,000 oftentimes will have to pay back $130,000 to $150,000 depending on the interest rate and the length of the loan and whatnot. So a community that says, well, we're just going to wait and we're just going to utilize the loan when it's time due, what they're saying is they're going to pay 30 to 50% more just because they don't want to budget for it years in advance. And on top of that, they're saying that the community members at the end of, when that cost comes due, are now going to have to pay for it. And the future members, if it's a loan, because now they're having to pay it back over, say, 12 or 15 years. So it's a complete lack of budgeting by prior years are directly impacting years membership many years into the future. It's completely unfair, and it should not be relied on. Loans are extremely costly and extremely difficult for a community to pay back while also trying to budget to get to a higher percent funded or to a more financial sound footing. Another one that communities very, very commonly do is another mistake they commonly do is deferring repair and replacement projects, as well as phasing them if they don't need to. Expenses go up over time. Project expenses go up over time every single year. In our reserve stays, typically we use a 3% inflation rate. So every year, say that paint project that we had talked about earlier for $100,000, if you let that go, say 2 years, well, that $100,000 project now is $106 plus $1,000 project. And since it's compound inflation, it's 3% compounded, it's going to be closer to $107,000. So you're paying an extra $7,000 because you deferred it a couple years. Now maybe there's a reason you deferred it. Maybe there's not enough money in the reserve account. But other times and if that's the case, that's the case. Unfortunately, you just have no way around it sometimes. But if there is money in the reserve account, you should not be deferring large projects. It's just it gets more costly as time goes on. Another common issue is incorrectly correlating the percent funded with the reserve account contribution rate. So communities that are 50% funded think that, well, we want to, or say they want to get to 50% funded, so they only deposit 50% of what we're recommending. That is extremely bad and inaccurate assessment of what percent funded is, as well as the math behind it. You will quickly run out of money if you try to follow that. And that's unfortunately a lot of board members have an inaccurate perception of what those numbers are. They're not to be interpreted that way. So again, 50% funded does not mean if you deposit 50% of the reserve account or the recommended rate into the reserve account, you're going to stay at 50% funded. You will absolutely not. You will quickly decline to a low percent funded range in a fairly short period of time. And the last thing is doing nothing. So many communities decide, we call it the head in the sand approach. They decide they just do not want to know about the reserve expenses. They do not want to set up a reserve account. They do not want to fund it. They don't want to talk about it. And it has an extremely negative impact on the financials of the association, the property values. Homeowners are oftentimes very upset. You have higher REOs or foreclosure rates in these communities. When you have large expenses coming up that have to be paid with loans or special assessments, and people have to scramble for money in their own personal lives, it's just a bad scenario, and it really should never get to that point. There's a board for a purpose. You're adopting budgets annually. You're supposed to be making these decisions ongoing. So there's really no need to just put your head in the sand, other than just not having to deal with it. It's an extremely common scenario, and you know, it's something that we try to prevent by providing very comprehensive and accurate reports. So community members and boards will know exactly what is projected to be coming due and how much they really should be setting aside in a reserve account. So that's some common mistakes. And lastly, last question, what does Washington state law say about how often and what components are needed in reserve studies? So on this one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch actually. Well, let's do this here real quick. So Washington state law, this was implemented in 2011 or 2012. And in Washington state, communities are required to have a reserve study done every year, annually. Every 3 years, they require an on-site visual inspection done by an independent reserve study professional. And a reserve study is required annually unless there's an undue hardship. Now, what does that exactly mean? What does undue hardship mean? Different interpretations of that. I can tell you that for the vast majority of most communities, it is not, in my opinion, undue hardship. The costs are not that significant. The cost of a paint project or roofs or whatnot are much, much higher than the cost of a reserve study. And just by not budgeting for those items, the amount that you're going to be paying in a higher cost in a future time is going to be much, much greater than a reserve study. Now, there's some further laws that state, I believe if it's over 5% of the budget, say reserve study expenses over 5% of the budget, then you can exempt yourself and whatnot. But let's just look at the actual Washington state law here real quick. Okay, so let's just go through this real quick. This is just setting up the reserve study account, or excuse me, the reserve account, and about what communities should complete one. So let's just look at it real quick. As you can see, number 2 here, unless doing so would impose an unreasonable hardship, an association with significant assets shall prepare and update a reserve study in accordance with the association's governing documents and this chapter. The initial reserve study must be based on a visual site inspection and conducted by a reserve study professional. Then number 3, again, unless doing so would impose an unreasonable hardship, the association shall update the reserve study annually. At least every 3 years, an updated reserve study must be prepared and based on a visual site inspection conducted by a reserve study professional. So that's the question of, should we, is it required to, does Washington state law require reserve studies? And yes, they are, unless doing so would impose an undue hardship. I would say that the vast majority of most communities out there would not be unduly hardshipped by a reserve study. In fact, the amount that they can save by following a reserve study and taking the recommendations from that are much, much greater than the cost of a reserve study. Let's go to the next one down. Reserve study requirements. And again, this goes into what needs to be included in the reserve study, different levels of reserve studies. And how a reserve study professional must include 100% funded level over a 30-year period. All these things, again, you can read through this and it's very helpful to see. If you pause the video here, you can read through these and see exactly what the law states about reserve studies and what's to be included in reserve studies. As you can see, let's see here. The reserve studies, it must include the quantities, estimates for the useful life of each reserve component, remaining useful life of each reserve component, and current major maintenance, repair, replacement costs for each reserve component. Now we often go to communities and they have an Excel spreadsheet that they're saying, well, this complies with our reserve study requirements, well, it doesn't have all these items. It's a significant amount of work, and just having an Excel spreadsheet with a number next to it based on either prior cost or just an estimation, that does not meet the requirements of a reserve study in Washington State. So I always like to point that out. Here's the next one down. Let's see. This is reserve account withdrawals. So we don't really worry much about that on our end. This is more for the boards. I always like to show it though. If you pause this and read through that, you can see exactly what Washington State indicates. How if you do utilize reserve account balances to pay for things like the operating expenses and whatnot, you can do that, but you must adopt a schedule not to exceed 24 months of repayment, and which is not unreasonably burden on the owners. So if you read through that, it's very apparent that we go to communities when they utilize, say, reserve account balances to pay for capital improvements. Say maybe they want to add a pool or a playground or this, that, or the other. Well, you can do that, but you do have to notify all the homeowners. You do have to create a repayment schedule within, it says 24 months. So, which in our experience is extremely rare. They don't do the rest of it. So they take the money out, but then they don't create a plan to repay it. They just treat it as a reserve expense. So let's see here. Next one down, demand for preparation and inclusion in the budget. I'll just put this up. You can read through that as well. Essentially, that community members can demand a reserve study be completed by an independent professional if they get together and put it in writing and vote on it. And I believe it says 35% of the voters. If at least that many, they can demand that, even if the board doesn't want to go through with it. Next one down, liability to directors and officers of the board. And exemptions here. Let's look at that one. That's a pretty good one. So an association, let's just read through this, is not required to follow reserve study requirements if the cost of the reserve study exceeds 5% of the association's annual budget. The association does not have significant assets, or there are 10 or fewer homes in the association. Again, with reserve studies though, it's not just about statutory requirements. The number one reason we suggest communities get a reserve study is for fairness to the community members, to make sure everybody's paying their fair share over time. We were doing reserve studies well before they enacted these laws, and that's always been our opinion. Now the laws were passed, and they've had some good. They've done some good. A lot of communities just don't follow them, frankly. But the number one reason is to fairly distribute these costs amongst the homeowners over time. So that's essentially Washington State law. Again, you can go here. You can just do a Google search and type in this up here. Just reserve study, Washington State RCW, or you can type in this RCW chapter number there, and that will pull it up right away for you here, and you can look through all that good stuff. So that's about it. Thank you for tuning in here. It was kind of a long-winded one, but hopefully it was very helpful, and I look forward to answering more questions. Let's see here. Sorry, I'm gonna. There we go. I look forward to answering any more questions that anybody might have. You can call, email. I like doing these videos to help people understand the rules and laws and whatnot, and I can answer questions very easily and create slides ahead of time so they make more sense to people, just my answers. But thank you so much. We look forward to talking with you in the near future.